Welcome back to another episode of Gaming on the Block, everyone. It has been a few weeks, but I'm pleased to tell you that it will be absolutely worth the wait. So I'm joined, as always, by my co-hosts, TSG and Mona, and we have a very special guest with us today in Vic. So Vic, we'll get to you in just a second. I want to just re-greet TSG. How's it going, man? You've been pretty busy on the Illuvium front for a little bit.
Yeah, it's been incredibly busy, but a lot of exciting things coming up, and happy to share that with you in this conversation today. Really looking forward to it. So
awesome. And Mona, from your end, you are in a new studio from the last time we recorded.
This is the debut of my new studio. I fired it up just for you guys. This thing has been 3 months now in the making, but here we are. So if I have any audio issues, please don't judge me. It's day one, and I did this just for you guys because I love you guys so much, and I'm so excited. We've been trying to get Vic on this show for as long as I've been building my studio.
Far too long.
Right. And I think there's a very good reason.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have been trying to get Vic on for a while. So for those that don't know, Vic is absolutely one of the pioneers in the Web3 space, particularly in the gaming sector. So she is the head of legal at Illuvium, and also really a thought leader in the sector for legal regulatory topics as it comes to Web3. Someone that I personally have been able to work with for a number of months now and appreciate her knowledge, her interest, and her focus on making sure that the industry is doing the right things and that the projects that she's supporting are taking all of the latest information into account, because we know the sector is growing at a pace unlike any other. So Vic, welcome to Gaming on the Block.
Guys, thank you so much for having me, and I'm sorry I've been so difficult to get onto.
No, you haven't been difficult. We have been difficult.
Yeah, it's been us three.
But in all fairness, people need to understand there's 4 different time zones here. I just want to mention that, just FYI. But we're here now. That's right. That's all that matters.
Yeah.
And it couldn't be more better timed as well. So we've got some really interesting stuff to cover, which has happened over the last couple of weeks. So it's actually a perfect time to have this conversation.
100%.
Yes, 100%.
Yes, absolutely.
This definitely needs to happen. So just a real quick disclaimer for our audience. Today's episode is going to be a little bit unique in that we're going to talk about a lot of legal, regulatory, structural topics as it relates to Web3. Now, even if we give feedback or ideas or advice for founders, while one of us on the panel is an attorney, Vic is not your attorney. And so if you need one, please make sure that you acquire professional guidance. And as informative as we're going to make this, this is not legal, financial, or other advice for you personally. We're here to share information about the sector in general. So that said, I do believe there's going to be a lot of value that we can provide for folks. So Vic, we want to start off a little bit with your perspective on regulation in the industry, right? Before we started the episode, you were talking about sort of what's old and what's new, how things are evolving in the sector. So I'd like to open us up with just your thoughts on, where is Web3 in general when it comes to regulation globally today?
Okay, what a big question. So, wow. Okay. Well,
you got this, Vic.
I think the most important and interesting thing is that the future of cryptocurrency is being defined, and we all have front row seats to that right now. And when I say cryptocurrency, I mean anything that is built on, facilitates, and relates to it. So we're talking about GameFi, DeFi, and all of the myriad applications and tech developments that you can see sort of in that loaded term. We can broadly define that into what's old and unfortunately chronically persistent, and then what's new. And my goodness, if you ever found reg or legal in the crypto space somewhat interesting and sexy, the past 2 months have been an absolute belter. And that's an Australian term for very active. Okay, so
I love it.
Let me break down what's old and unfortunately persistent and slightly frustrating. So first of all, the legal status of many cryptocurrencies remains unclear in many jurisdictions, but there is a centric focus on the US at this point in time. We're living in a new world order, and that is, in the aftermath of FTX, Celsius, Terra Luna, BlockFi, Genesis, 3AC, Voyager, Signature, SVB. The list can go on, but it's an absolute washout. And regulators have adopted a very specific tone and approach in this, post 2023. Let's just call it a black swan year. And that agenda and that tone is, you have a nice saying that wraps it up, and that's regulation by enforcement. So rather than seeking to produce curated legislation and to produce frameworks for crypto market regulation, key players, so the SEC in the US, which regulates securities, and the CFTC, which regulates, SEC regulates securities, CFTC regulates commodities. They have pursued regulation by enforcement agendas. And most notably, if you read any form of crypto news, you would have known and seen the SEC's actions against Coinbase and Binance that were launched earlier this month. I will get into that in a minute, but I just wanted to explain that sort of that general framework or agenda of regulation by enforcement is something that is prevailing, and that the political interest and public interest in crypto has noticeably cooled. That being the case, it's still expensive, risky, and incredibly difficult to operate without clear legal parameters, and that produces inevitably tidal movements in the shift and flow of projects, capital and talent into and out of jurisdictions, but also thematics. Now, there are a myriad of far more learned analysts that take a look at these types of flows when it comes to thematics. But jurisdictions is something that it's my job to keep across. And I will talk about that in a little second. But fundamentally, I think the big tie-up for what's old and unfortunately persistent is that we can expect this regulatory overlay to inform how projects perform, how they raise capital, where they reside, what thematics are invested in, and that's not going to go away. How we respond to it, that's something that can change. And so now I'm going to move into what is actually new. I wrote a list before we had our meeting, and we're going to film this. And it just looks like a veritable laundry list of activity. So let me take you through it. In the US, most recently, we've had the Ripple order come down from the New York District Court, where Judge Torres finally gave some direction on the 2020 case that the SEC brought against Ripple and one of its founders and its CEO. So that case is a pretty significant, it's not a judgment, it is an order. And that order is really significant because it gives some early thinking by a very authoritative court and jurisdiction about its thoughts about some of the SEC's arguments. Now, one of the most pernicious arguments that the SEC had advanced was the nature of a token and the fact that it was the subject of a securities contract, that would mean that the substance of that investment contract, which is a type of security, is also a security. And that's just simply not the case. And that's a really, really big win for the crypto industry at large, because it breaks that theory. The other important thing that emanated out of the Ripple, I keep on saying judgment, but I can't, judgment order. The other really important thing that emanated out of the Ripple order was this, a division between some of the different distributions that were made. And so 3 distribution categories were identified and put to the court for their assessment about whether they met or passed the Howie Test, which is the test in the US about whether something is a security or not. And so in relation, there were 3 different types of distributions. There were distributions made to institutional investors further to agreements. There was programmatic sales, and there were a category of other, and that other category were distributions in consideration for services in the case of employees and then third parties. So the most important thing and the big takeaway on the assessment by the court of those different distribution methods was that programmatic sales are not do not in and of themselves constitute investment contracts and therefore are not a type of security. So that is a win for the industry. Now, importantly, the court also considered whether institutional sales further to investment agreements constituted investment contracts, and the court found that that in fact was the case. Now, it's important to take this all with a grain of salt because this is actually something that's assessed on the facts objectively observed in each case. So the takeaway, the big takeaway here from this Ripple order is first, it doesn't have the force of an appellate court decision, and it's likely that the SEC will appeal it. So to take everything that's been said as positive, but not a playbook as such for a distribution method in the US, but it's definitely a positive sign. So that's the SEC order, the order in relation to the SEC matter against Ripple. But behind that, we have some other really interesting action that's happened. So we've also got...
Yeah, so Vic, can I jump in? I've got a question on that point. You're mentioning about a potential appeal from the SEC is one that I think we even spoke about on here in one of our last episodes, that we don't think that this is the last you'll see from this case. I would ask you from a strategic standpoint, though, is there some risk that the SEC might elect not to appeal because they're concerned about actually losing the appeal and then having some clearer lines that are drawn? It strikes me that you might actually have a better chance pursuing a policy of regulation by enforcement if you don't actually have an appellate court, or certainly the Supreme Court from a U.S. standpoint, ruling on some of these controversial matters.
That's a fantastic point, and it's definitely one to take into consideration. In respect of the SEC's agenda and this very aggressive positioning in relation to crypto assets and going after the major exchanges, this is an agenda that I don't see letting up anytime soon, and that's evidenced by some other actions that we've seen, and most recently is literally 30 minutes ago, and a new action that's being filed. It's important to recognise that regulation by enforcement as an agenda isn't likely to go away until there is a federal crypto market regulatory framework and likely regulator. And so until we have something like that in place in the US, it's unlikely that we'll see sort of any letting up on SEC actions, and then by equal measure CFTC actions. There's also the competition or the tug of war over that turf and those two regulatory institutions and what they will and won't get to regulate in respect of each other. So that's another little factor to keep in mind.
Okay, very good. So I think that was, as you mentioned, Vic, the most, I'd say the most relevant and longest running action that we've been looking on some information for. What else have you seen, though, in the past few weeks that creates this overall perspective on regulation in the sector?
It's definitely the biggest, and it's probably the most expensive. And Brett Garlinghouse came out and said that they've spent around about $200 million on that action. So it's a very expensive activity. Now, setting Ripple aside, there's been some other really interesting stuff, and this is one for DAOs. So Barnbridge DAO earlier in the month, they are a risk tokenization protocol. They ceased all operations through a Discord message from their appointed legal counsel. And that was a pretty interesting one that I noticed earlier in the month. We also have some interesting stuff happening at a more global scale. So I want to move a little way from the US, apart from to say that there are some regulatory developments in respect of developing a federal crypto market regulatory framework. And that's, of course, the Loomis-Gellibrand bill, and then McThompson and Henry, I'm saying that wrong, It is
It's okay. That's why
It
we're
is
not
Thompson
live.
and Henry.
Henry.
McHenry.
Henry and something.
Oh, it's Mick Henry. I was like,
Yes.
you're saying it right. Mick
Oh
Henry,
my
right?
God.
Which that was a very close argument, but their proposition had a little flaw in it, correct?
Well, they both approach crypto market regulation and frameworks from a different perspective, but the likelihood is that the McHenry and Thompson bill will succeed. It's a more superior assemblage of minds in relation to the matter, and it's without being an expert in how US legislation is developed. It seems like this is going to be the more likely of the two bills that will succeed.
But their test, they are incorporating the Howie test in their proposition initially, right there. The product has to go through the Howie test initially, correct?
I think that's the case, but I would have to double check it because it's been a little while since I've read McHenry and Thompson.
Yeah, it's been a little while that I read it too. Same.
This is what's happening in the US, and I think it's really important to see what is happening in relation to other developments abroad, and then specifically in the EU and for gaming, the UAE. So most recently, or in the last couple of months, we've also had some really interesting stuff happen. So in the EU, we had ESMA, which is the body that is responsible for developing technical standards for the MiCA regulation, which is a EU-wide crypto market regulation initiative. They came out with their first technical standards, which is basically their roadmap for how they're going to implement registration and basically regulate that 27 member state trade block. That's a fascinating one because that is an exercise in complexity, to put it mildly, and you're going to start seeing independent regulators from each of the countries inside the EU start to compete with one another effectively to onboard virtual asset service providers into their jurisdictions. And we're already seeing that with leading states being France, Germany, and Italy. So it's important to know that there's a couple of other drops of technical standards that will happen over the coming months and before the MiCA is phased in, its initial phase in next year. And the technical standards really are the playbook. So if you are looking at being regulated, if you do want to be registered, if you do want to operate in the EU, you now see that that roadmap and what you need to do to get to that point of being registered and licensed to operate in those jurisdictions. Alongside that, we've seen two global standard settings developments, and that is one of them is kind of like a really naughty report card, and so that's from FATF, which is the AML and CTF regulatory authority, and that helps countries set legislation and therefore a harmonized standard for AML and CTF laws. Now, recently, as June, so late June, they published a report about the implementation of FATF standards to virtual asset and virtual asset service providers. And the report was not very happy jam, which is an Australian saying for not good. I think
I'm going to start using that, guys.
Absolutely.
Please do. 75% of the countries that were surveyed for that report were found to have not implemented to an adequate standard FATF recommendations in relation to VASPs. And then the travel rule was a bit of an issue there too. The travel rule being something that requires the sharing of information that follows certain threshold transactions across borders. So that covers the FATF, the naughty report card. And that's an important one, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the other one was IOSCO, and IOSCO is a standard setting body, and they published in May, so late May, but the consultation is open till September. They published this consultation paper for crypto market regulation. So in general, if you're going to wrap all of this up with a bow, we can see that we're entering a new era And that area is one of impending implementation of regulation. That's a lot of ums in a sentence, but it's really relevant to projects that are looking to build into the next environment and therefore, by inference, into the next bull market. So those projects that have built in and are robust and implement, developed risk management and compliance solutions and are ready to be regulated and are registered and licensed, they will do better than those that are not. Let's go back to FATF. FATF is an interesting one. Now, being in the DeFi realms, the idea of being KYC'd is anathema to a lot of activity in DeFi and in GameFi. But I think that, and my prediction is that this is going to be a very hotly contested field in which projects look at in the cold, hard light of day, where they want adoption and they want to be licensed and they want to be able to operate, or whether they want to stay in the veritable shadows and remain unregulated, decentralized, anonymous. So I think we're going to see a really interesting splitting of industry, and those who want to go down the route of being regulated and licensed and ready to roll into jurisdictions that are actively investing in and very capital friendly for GameFi projects, and those that don't.
Is there a middle ground here, Vic? I know, for instance, we've been talking in some projects that I advise and work with about like zero knowledge KYC and this opportunity to potentially have a solution that strikes the middle ground, that you could certainly verify an individual's identity, but then effectively mask them, but you can verify, something like an age or, classifications as far as, anti-terrorism activities and so forth that might be necessary. Is there a pathway that exists to be zero knowledge KYC compliant in some of these jurisdictions?
Great question. The proof will be in the pudding. And the reason why I'm asking it in such or responding to your question in such vague terms is it's going to be dependent on what a regulator finds acceptable. And it's also going to depend precisely on what the game does. When you have a closed loop environment, you don't have issues. When you have an in-game environment where assets are traded and developed, exchanged, and then there is an exit on that in-game environment and they can then be traded for real world value, whether that's fiat or digital, then you have the requirement to make sure that you are compliant with AML and CTF laws. So it's going to depend on the game. It's going to depend on the environment. And it's going to depend on the regulator. And one of the wonderful things is that we have now the impending implementation of new regulatory frameworks, and we're going to start seeing what regulators do agree to and what they don't. The laws will remain the same, but this gives some room for experimentation. And I think given that we all emanate from the DeFi, GameFi space, it's really important that we consider what privacy-enhancing technologies can we use, like KYC, to explore how to preserve our customers' privacy and integrity around their personal information, and also allow us to comply with our legal obligations to remain licensed. So it's going to be a really interesting space over the next 12 to 24 months, particularly now that countries are effectively on notice. If you're not implementing AML CTF laws and they don't apply to VASPs, you're going to be in trouble. So it's a very much a watch this space.
Annie, I have a question. I was interviewing the founder of Upland, Edon Zuckerman, last week. And I'm not sure if how familiar you guys are with Upland, but I was very fascinated by their business model. I mean, Upland, just to give a quick background, they're built on EOS blockchain. They maintain their number 6 spot on DApp Radar with 105,000 active users. They're considered a super app. And they're the first metaverse app on mobile, and it begins with a selling of real-time virtual property, but it goes beyond it by allowing gamification of assets, and they offer developers platform on Upland to build games on. But what really stood out to me about Upland is its implementation of GameFi, all without the need for an externally traded token. So they have incorporated this NFT to fiat business model. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is a model that maybe more games might be looking into based on what Vic is saying? Or is play to earn as we know it what is going to push forward and still progress?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a mix of, as in any innovative space like this. I like how Vic outlined sort of this question of having internal closed loop economies, where that's what we typically think about in Web 2, right? Your TSG, if you and I go and we're playing Pokemon against each other, like there's an economy there, but it's all closed loop. You can't take that Pikachu on the shelf behind you and convert it into $10 and then interact with the rest of the world. Generally speaking, we know that there are black markets that have existed for decades in gaming, but they're not sanctioned by the companies, which I think is the big difference with Web 2. Mona, to your question, though, I think you're going to see a lot more studios and try and create a very carefully controlled closed loop ecosystem, and then do a lot as far as like having a very clear single entrance and exit ramp from their platform, right? So they may say, you can do all of this stuff here in game, and then you're going to have just this one avenue where you can take this token out into the public, and that approach is what they're going to be focused on gating from a regulatory standpoint. I think you're going to see more of that, as opposed to projects that take the time and build everything on chain, and you can swap every NFT and token that exists, and you just have this kind of wide open framework. I think that's probably going to be more difficult from a regulatory standpoint to steer, other than like if you have much more internal control. But there are some projects, I mean, I can think of Dungeon Miner, and you look at like Dark Forest and some of these projects that have really been going full on chain from day one, that are kind of paving the way for what that would look like. I think you're going to see a mix between both approaches that projects utilize.
Yeah, I mean, with 100 and what did I say? It was like 5,000 active users. And I checked that stat on Sunday, by the way. And those are active wallets. They're doing something right. And they are taking that close economy, like you and Vic were alluding to, approach. And so I'm wondering, maybe initially that's the way to go. But I'm also, Vic, seeing a lot of companies, Web3 companies and gaming companies, and I'll go as far as saying VCs too, because A16Z just recently announced they're opening an office in London. Now, it might just be an office, but Gala Games is moving it all back to London. Is that what we're going to start seeing as this regulation progresses and brings a bit of hesitancy to be here in the state? Is that the direction? Do you see gaming go as well, to kind of pack up and go back overseas, or does it matter?
So do you mean out of the US and then into other jurisdictions that are a little bit more?
Exactly.
100%. And like the writing is on the wall. There's two factors here at play. I'll speak to the first one because I think that's probably one of the ones that's probably a little contentious for some of our listeners that are familiar with MiCA. Now, whether MiCA applies to NFTs, and NFTs are an important vehicle in GameFi, so this is why I wanted to sort of just touch on it very briefly. The jury is out about whether MiCA will in fact apply in relation to NFTs, and therefore, by inference, require vehicles that trade in them, generate them, issue them, whether they will also be captured by this very expansive EU regulation. So the jury is out. There's no official statement on this, but a few law firms have theorized and written on this. And like the TLDR here is that fungibility within an NFT collection will meet the threshold requirement of MiCA, whereas unique collectible assets that are completely distinctive in and of themselves will not be regulated. So this specific exclusion, for all the people that are very nerdy and want to actually go out and read the MiCA laws, it's actually in the recitals. And we can't expect to get clarity on this until ESMA, which is that body that's producing the technical standards, actually deliver a little bit more alpha on it. So it's a really interesting time to sort of see whether this region will in fact embrace and NFTs and capture it within its regulatory perimeter, which has long-range implications for GameFi. Now, speaking to other general counsels that are in the GameFi space, there's a thing called a regulatory hedge. You don't end up getting registered and licensed in one jurisdiction. You go for everywhere. And you either withdraw your application if it's not going to look successful, because nobody wants an unsuccessful application on the books. It doesn't look good for your next jurisdiction. So this regulatory hedge means that GameFi companies, large ones, they're usually very well funded. They have activities and departments that can actually, perform this work. They go out and they try a little bit of everything. I want to go to the UAE, which is where I'm based. I can tell you now unequivocally there is a lot of activity in this region, and I'll pull up a few stats for you on this from my trusty copy of Golf Biggest Business.
Love it. Love it.
There's a
story time, everyone.
There's a big glossy editorial here, but just some fun facts for you guys. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund emerged as the largest external shareholder of Nintendo this year, with 8.3% of the company. There is a national gaming and esports strategy that by 2030, its objective is to have 39,000 direct and indirect job openings in our region. What else have I got for you? In the Emirates, approximately 64% of men and 58% of women are involved in digital gaming. This is massive. It's a growth market, and that's reflected in the types of investments that are being made here. So through Savvy Games, there's a $38 billion fund. So it's just exceptional. So yes, I do see a move, and there's two reasons for that. Regulatory frameworks that will accommodate projects, such as here in the UAE under VARA, and then MiCA in the EU, but then also the flow of funds or the flow of capital.
Cool. I want to ask Vic, with the United States being the largest capital market in the space, and how they really thrived off innovation, and the gaming industry and digital markets and everything being that innovative space that it is, how do you think that sentiment in US regulation is going to affect all the other jurisdictions, and do we need them to be on board to really see the space grow in the long run?
Great question. Look, this is really hard to apply, so my opinion is going to be just as good as anybody else's in the area. But whenever you have the appearance of innovation and the support of innovation, and the support of innovation really is, access to breadth and depth of talent, capital, and a clear and easy regulatory framework upon which you can, build your business. When you say that you're an innovative country and you support innovation, but then you fail to provide those three critical ingredients for commercial success for any industry, if you fail to provide them, then you're innovative in name only and definitely not in deed. And until the US has actually established a federal framework for regulating crypto in general and in crypto markets, until there is really proof positive that those three essential ingredients are supported, we can't expect the US to exceed or succeed any other jurisdictions that are actively cultivating those industries, actively supporting businesses to build, to scale through the development of regulatory frameworks, but also through capital and through talent.
Yeah, and just for those that maybe don't know, what are some of those jurisdictions that are being positive and really focusing on building that out?
That is 100% the UAE. That's why I packed my bags, and I said ciao for now to Australia, and I'm here. It is it's undeniably a very, very active ecosystem, and it's really exciting, to be honest. It's really exciting to see the types of projects that are coming here, the movement of capital, or the flow of capital, the vibrancy of the VC community here, what's coming out of all other sort of jurisdictions. So the MENA region, India, project, the regulatory refugees from Australia and from the US. It really is. It definitely has a sense of being a very energized community here.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm surprised to hear that of Australia. Kieran and I actually talked about this because I was asking Kieran if he thought gaming would be regulated equally as DeFi, and he let me know that how involved they are in some of those decision-making processes and how much they communicate with. I don't know what the SEC version of SEC is in Australia. There you go. So I'm surprised that they're taking a more harsher approach as well. That's surprising.
I should be fair to Australia. I don't think that it's a completely it's backwater. I definitely don't think that at all. We have a lot of incredible talent and fantastic projects in Australia. And we will continue to be a place that produces incredible talent in the space. The overarching issue is that ASIC has adopted a similar agenda to the SEC and an agenda of regulation by enforcement. But that is also paired alongside a lot of very healthy stakeholder engagement and consideration of what that framework might look like. The point that should be made is that there is an arms race towards becoming the most vibrant crypto ecosystem. And that race is between different countries or different regions. And that those jurisdictions that are already sort of in that policy life cycle from ideation, policy, consultation and engagement, draft laws, passing laws, laws implemented, and now supervisory. The further you are along in that policy to law life cycle, the further you are along in the race. And being in a benevolent jurisdiction in which laws are passed in a very different way to a democratic law-producing process, things move a lot quicker. And there's also that agility to amend as required. And that can go in one of two ways. It can be really beneficial when it comes to amending regimes that require quick amendments because they haven't contemplated the breadth of activity, but they can also be very annoying when they implement, for example, new tax laws overnight. So there are the benefits and disadvantages, the features of each jurisdiction and how laws are passed, and that sort of naturally plays into that larger macro of who is going to win this race towards creating a really fantastic jurisdiction for VASPs and crypto and GameFi and DeFi in general.
Yeah, and to that point, Vic, I think we'll see that shift over time because in many places like the US, for instance, depending on how the election in 2024 goes, you might see almost a complete 180 turnaround based on which individual legislators come into the Senate in particular, but also from the White House standpoint. And that's going to have ripple effects downward through the SEC and the CFTC and other groups as well. So I think very interesting to keep an eye on it because we may see things change almost on a dime. We've also seen in the past with similar innovation, the U.S. in particular hasn't always been at the forefront of innovation. Oftentimes it's been a fast follower and it's let other smaller countries or regions take take the brunt of the hit of working through the innovation, and then just decided to sort of copy with pride the regulatory frameworks that have emerged that they felt have worked. So this may be a pathway that we see over the next decade as well.
It's always open to you to be a fast follower, and it's a lot easier being a fast follower. But fast followers don't tend to, what's the old saying? If you don't risk it, you don't get the biscuit.
Yeah.
If you're a fast follower, you're necessarily not first. So it's definitely an interesting time, and it's an interesting space to keep your eyes peeled on.
Yeah, fully agreed. So let's move from thinking about sort of where we're going to see innovation in the Web3 gaming space to how. And this question of tokens and NFTs, you've mentioned a few times already, Vic, that the future of NFTs in particular are pretty uncertain in most of the regulatory frameworks that are being contemplated. If you had to take a stab at it, how do you think tokens and NFTs are going to evolve in gaming in particular as we see more clarity emerge from a regulatory standpoint?
Okay, I think it comes back to, so there'll be a degree of geography. I think that there will be a trend away from the US. That's sort of, it's a bit of a fait accompli. If you're in a jurisdiction that has adopted an agenda of regulation by enforcement, you're more likely to end up domiciling a project where you are encouraged and welcome to set up and operate. So I think we can expect to see that as a general trend or movement. I think we can also see that crypto exchanges, which are likely to be more strictly regulated, there'll be a decided shift towards DEXs, and that sort of thinking about how tokens are distributed and thinking about how those different key features of a crypto market operate, I think that needs to play into an overall consideration about how games will produce their tokens and how they will be distributed. Necessarily, we can see that altcoins and anything that's identified as a security or likely as a security is incredibly problematic. So we'll necessarily see interest in non-security type tokens. This will inevitably inform the design of governance tokens, and we will see, I expect we will see great care in the design and what features or utility follow from the issuance of governance tokens. What else can we likely see? Well, I mean, in relation to the, going back to the SEC's cases against Binance and Coinbase, we saw Sandbox, Decentraland, and Axie Infinity identified as prospective security tokens. Anything that resembles the tokenomics attached to those types of tokens is definitely problematic, and I think that will inform how projects come to market. And then finally, layer ones that are also identified as securities, anything that's built on those layer ones, we'll definitely see a trend away from them. So that's sort of in general, but these are all sort of very much market predictions. And until we sort of see the dust settle on what jurisdictions like the US are in fact going to do, and whether this continued agenda of regulation by enforcement will subsist, or it will give way to something a little more conducive to the innovation agenda, to put it nicely, or are we going to see, if that's going to be the case, and we're going to see a flow of projects into other jurisdictions, what those jurisdictions actually have to offer, and what's the competitive tension between those jurisdictions that are actively encouraging GameFi investment.
So TSG, we've talked a little bit about how sort of retail gamers are going to be approaching the sector. And I know you work a lot with content creators. This has also been a hot topic recently with some pretty public fallouts of content creators with some of their projects, in particular that are promoting token structures and NFT sales. How do you think this is going to evolve from a creator perspective, right? How are Web3 creators going to shift and adapt their approach based on some of these regulatory changes that Vic's bringing up?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's depending on the regulation and what it turns out to be. If they're promoting securities, that's just not that's just not a good look. It doesn't matter how many times you say this is not financial advice. If your sole focus is pushing out content like that, it's you're kind of, it's just not a good look for you. If regulation goes our way and everything's all good and it's not, and it's pretty much an open market, we're going to see that with creators. There are going to be creators that really focus on the token side of things. We're going to have creators that focus on the gameplay side of things. It really depends on the brand that they're trying to build. And truthfully, I'm sure we all know it. I hate these videos, but any video with, this token is going to 1,000x. They do substantially better than anything else. And I hate it, but the market is what the market is. So again, if regulation goes in our favor and is positive towards what we're doing, I guarantee we're still going to see a lot of that. And it doesn't matter. I don't think it's going to matter how much hashtag ad, hashtag not financial advice things, disclaimers you put on it. At some point, they will. And we've already seen it with like things with Kim Kardashian in the past and a couple of those high tier influencers already. So yeah, I hope that goes away, but I think if the market allows for it to happen, it's going to happen. That's just, there's no stopping that.
Don't you think that
I have never done that, Mona? I have never done 1,000x.
You degen casino gambler.
Don't put that on me. Now, sorry, so what did you want to ask?
No, but don't you see that there is two sides to this tokenization business, right? There is a side that is more in DeFi, and sure, if I own the token that is linked to the growth of your business, then that goes under security and that goes under decentralized finance. I think we all have to remember, what was the premise of Web3? It was ownership of content, right? Mm-hmm. So content creation is also attached to tokenization, where it comes into practice through token gating, right? Or giving power back to the creator. So you have a token here that is used in two different ways. Do you see that? So do you think that we can still respect and preserve the tokenization that that content creators can benefit from, as opposed to decentralized finance?
I mean,
you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. I genuinely think there are ways that they can do it without overstepping. And again, I'm not against it. I'm not saying like, we just shouldn't cover it and not talk about it. I think it is a big part of the industry and the value that it brings. It's just, what's the angle? Like what you're saying, right? It's like, well, what angle will we be taking with it? So, no, yeah, your point stands. Your point 100% stands.
Yeah, I mean, I like the tokenization model that Web3 brings, and I like that content creators can now be in control and in charge of their work and be able to make money and eliminating the middleman.
Yeah, there's always ways to, I don't know, there are always ways to do that. I don't think tokenization is required to do that. It's just another, if you're a content creator and you're saying the only way I can get that result is through tokenization, you're just not looking at the whole picture. So
right.
Like that, I think that's fine. If we're talking about tokenization like that, cool, that's not an issue. I don't see any problem with that. If we're talking about GameFi tokens and, for example, someone covering SLP and Axie, things like that, again, it depends on the type of content. If you're giving straight financial advice with saying, it's 1,000x, this or that, don't do that. I mean, look, do that if you want. Tell me how it goes for you. I wouldn't recommend it. But if you're talking about tokens as, this is the implication of this token, this is how this token works. If you're kind of breaking it down and doing analysis on it without saying, like analyzing it and saying, this is how this works, this is the process of it all, I think educational content is completely fair game. But again, saying that this is my thoughts are, if we get this many players, the token is going to go to this price. Like, that's very murky waters that I would recommend against for any content creator. Yeah, Vic, jump in.
Yeah.
And
I would say more than murky waters is going to get you into very hot water.
Yeah.
The Ripple order is actually, it's not a long decision. It's worth taking a look at because you can see some of the early thinking of Judge Torres. Oh, not early thinking, but the thinking of Judge Torres in relation to the significance of marketing. And this is just confined in respect of thinking about how the Howie Test applies. It's never a subjective test. It's an objective assessment on all the facts as to whether the creator of the token has actually actively promoted and marketed it as having a speculative attribute, or the fact that it may be speculated with is very separate and distinct to the promises and the marketing push behind that token. So that, I mean, really, if there is an important takeaway for anyone that's building, designing, and promoting a project, it is exercising extreme care in relation to their marketing efforts, and oftentimes having a really good relationship between your CMO and your legal team is really important.
So essentially, focus on for all projects out there, and correct me if I'm wrong, focus on the product and not the token and what comes with that. Focus on just making a good product, the benefits of that, rather than the token can do this and this. Is that
just not promising that it's going to go to the moon and whatever X is going to be when you buy it.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
So no mention of the moon, essentially. Just no mention of the moon, Mars, nothing like that.
Mars, yes. Moon, no. Stars, yes. Moon, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, unless you're a spacefaring game and that's the actual core gameplay, probably best to stay away from it.
Just
but
galaxies, stay out of the galaxies, all right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard even the spacefaring games aren't having a great time right now. I'm sorry, I shouldn't.
No,
Too soon.
not at the moment.
Too soon.
Too soon.
But I would say I think this brings up one of the points, though. Frankly, the content for creators that are putting information out there. Here's how you play the game better. That's 100 times less cringe than, oh, here's the token price right now, and what happens if you see 3 times more players join the game? Like, this is what the token price is going to be later. Like, people can do math just fine. Like, tell them how to play the game. Like, there's a big challenge, I think, where a lot of creators want to stake out core position in a new game that they think is gonna be very valuable and have a sustainable economy. So they want to be there creating content early, but they're really pushing to create content where there isn't any meaningful content to exist. And so I think part of this is we need to see less creators focusing on just building up an audience within the ecosystem, talking about the tokens while the team is still in the very early development stages, and instead start focusing on, okay, these are the gameplay mechanics that we know right now. Speculate about how to apply those. Talk about communities and guilds in your games and those esports competitions.
The issue from a content creator's point of view is those videos don't get views. the token speculation get the views.
I know, 100%. Yeah, but I think part of this will change as the industry evolves as well, and once you've got gameplay mechanics. I mean, from a Web 2 standpoint, I can't tell you how many hours of gameplay content I've consumed from different titles that I was playing. That they get a lot of viewership. But that's because the game was out. I didn't watch anything about those games 4 years before the game launched. That we're just talking about the development studio because, like, I was there as effectively a stakeholder in the project's success that early.
Yeah.
Andrew Wall our good friend Andrew Wall has always said this, that the paradigm shift in gaming has always happened the same. Some company, some studio takes a genre that has already exist and makes the best version of that. And in this case, it uses or can use Web3 features as a new business model and create a compelling IP that people love and will virally share it. And that's how the paradigm shift in gaming has always happened. So it is about creating a compelling IP. It is about people virally sharing that game. And if you can achieve that, then that business model, the Web3 business model, kind of becomes secondary. And I think those are wise words from our friend Andrew Wall.
Mr. Wall, yeah.
Very much agree.
Indeed.
So with that said, I'd like to ask for any other final wise words. We're getting ready to wrap up today. But Vic, as you think about the sector and what we've talked about today, what would be a final message you'd like to leave with our audience as they think about Web3 gaming and regulation in general?
Okay, I've got one for the games out there that are listening with keen ears around marketing and around how do they promote their projects without falling afoul of the Howie Test. And I'm going to leave them with this. It's a Taylor Swift quote. Players are going to play. If you design a fantastic game and your token in fact is speculated upon, that is completely separate and distinct from whether that speculative motive is derived from the entrepreneurial or managerial efforts of others, i.e. you. So be very careful about how you promote your project, but knowing the players are going to play. So that's on the marketing front. And then the other side is we are entering a new space, a new era in which regulation is a reality, not just for GameFi, but for crypto in general. And being alive to what that means. If you want to have access to a market, if you want to be licensed in a market that is now implementing a crypto market regulatory framework, you're going to need to arm yourself internally with advice, with compliance officers, with very unsexy concepts of KYC, with sanctions checks, with third-party transaction monitoring. And so making those calls early about what direction you're going to go in and how you're going to implement is very much part of your overall strategy. So yeah, they're my two little gems.
Cool. Yeah, I'm going to jump in here. I've got some final thoughts as well. I've got some advice that I want to share with all. I don't know why you guys are laughing.
Let me get this. Going to be really important. Hold on.
Not legal advice, not financial.
No, this is 100% legal advice. No, what everyone should do, all the projects out there, what they should do is they should go and hire a Vic, not Vic, because she belongs to, she's with us. I would say belongs, that's horrible. She's with us, she's on our team, but definitely go and hire a Vic for your team and it will do you guys a world of good. That is my advice, and that is legal advice. Do that.
I will give a shameless plug and say that I have launched a new Web3 and GameFi specific practice that I am involved in, but that does not ever take away from my one and true love, which is Illuvium. And so I do provide consulting on this. But more importantly, not every lawyer can provide the full solution for you. And I think it's really important to know where to start looking. So if there are people that are interested and do want to understand if there's some legal resources, some reg advice that they can receive, I'm more than happy to open my network and build some referrals or make some recommendations. So I think it's really important. Accessing this type of information earlier is much better.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a nice little segue.
Mona, any last words of wisdom from your share?
I think you guys covered it all. I think, it's important as you just I'm a business woman myself, and to have a successful team, you always bring the best talent into your team, and legal is a big part of that. Actually, legal stands at the very top of that, especially in our industry. So, Vic, thank you so much for taking from your busy day and coming and sharing your insight and knowledge with us. We all appreciate it. It's very hard to find. Taxes and legal are the hardest talent to find in our industry, who understand not just nationally, but globally, how this is going to apply in different jurisdictions. So thank you so much for all your insight today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. So, Vic, thank you so much. I believe that our audience is much more informed than they were before they walked into this episode today. And we look forward to having all of you back next time on Gaming on the Block.
Peace.